Yes, it's true how 2020 has proven that nurses, and Tina Turner got it wrong. Nurses are not professional. So let's jump in and have a look at the screen. So Tina Turner actually was a nurse's aide. She, of course, was a hugely professional and successful musical icon, but before she had her first child, and working as a nurse's aide at Barnes Jewish Hospital in St. Louis, she actually was trying to prepare for trying to be a good mother and to be caring. And with that, she was looking for an income, and she really seriously thought about becoming a nurse practitioner, until of course she went to fame. And What's Love Got to Do With It was one of her songs, and the reality is she was wrong, because there isn't much love for nurses. So when we look back at COVID-19 at the very beginning of it and try and foretell the future with it, of course we're looking at vaccines and stuff like that, and then of course nurses are really, really important because they're central to the care of people, they're central to the administration of vaccines, they're central to looking after people after they've had vaccines and so on, not to mention the illnesses and prolonged deaths that we could have and so on. But we look at World War III and we link it up with the coronavirus, because that's how it was linked with by the experts, the so-called experts, not just in health but in economics and other areas. And they looked at World War I, 1914-ish, 1940s, early 1940s that is, World War II, and they said, hey, these particular wars affect a lot of people, but directly there weren't all the countries in the world fighting. Whereas the pandemic in 2020, this coronavirus was actually affecting everybody. It spread throughout the world. Even, as you can see here, it affected the entire Latin American region, which was totally escaped by all those previous world wars, 1 and 2. So this is why the whole fighting of this pandemic, the fighting of the virus, got into people's lives other than the health regions, because there was decisions that had to be made by governments. And these decisions, of course, were not coordinated by each and every government. In fact, even if we looked at internally within the United States, its own continent, you have all these states that have their own governors and leaders, and then you had, of course, Donald Trump, who was the president, and the decision making, the coordination there, and the overall effectiveness, or what they thought was effective, it wasn't agreed upon. And there was arguments toing and froing from leaders of states and those in higher up positions and Donald Trump himself. So we look at Europe, again, all the individual countries were doing things differently, Africa, South America and so on. So there was a total difference of opinion going on, and this is how things can challenge people on the ground, like nurses. And nurses are going to go, well, hey, hang on a second, I need to be looked after. But they were not. Compared to world leaders and nurses, again, when the pandemic hit, the nurses were the guys at the forefront. These were the guys that were saving lives. The governments weren't saving lives. But here we look at 2015, Ireland. This is a country that is central to Europe, very pivotal, English-speaking, west coast of Europe, away from Britain, who had just left the Eurozone, and still central and linking, a great link from Europe to America. So you have Ireland 5 years before the pandemic hits, nurses seeking reversal of pay cuts and pension levy. So what was the pay cuts? The pay cuts were coming from essentially the 2008 world recession. So 12 years later, and even when this particular article was written even, and it was read first off, was of course 7 years after 2008. So there was major industrial action that was being taken or thought to be taken by the nurses because they weren't getting proper pay. Now this is in a very sophisticated society of Ireland where they have the best nurses, the very best training, best education and most care, huge tradition of being vocationary, huge tradition of being good and caring, coming from a background Catholicism of looking out for other people and so on. So these were the best, the creme de la creme of nurses, and yet they weren't even being paid properly in 2020, when years of debates of whether they are being paid properly or should they be paid properly, let's compare them to other countries, they said, so let's do that. So So not long before 2020, the actual coronavirus came, of course, in 2020. In 2019, this particular article was showing the comparisons of England and Ireland, the nurses, and their pays and so on. And you can see here where essentially there was roughly 20 to 40% of a difference across the ways. So you had on scale 1, number 1 there, you have 30,178, and that's in euro. Of course, that translates as 26,706 with regard to the British pound. There was a 21% deficit still straight away with the nurses in Ireland as opposed to England. And it goes the whole way up, right to 45,000 even, in comparison to 40,000. And again, that's a 39% difference. So there was need for strikes, and there was the beginning of strikes just happening in Ireland before 2020. So this is essentially how real world and first world nurses, educated nurses, these are the people that should be right up there at the very top. These are the people that were needed, so needed, when the world changed with the pandemic, and yet they were not getting basic pay. They were highly educated, they had degrees, they had an attitude of being just wonderful and caring, and yet they just weren't. They were making decisions of world leaders, as pressurized as world leaders. They were putting themselves in the cold front of getting the disease, forefront of getting the disease, and yet world leaders were behind masks outside making speeches and coming up with no decisions and getting paid quadruple more. Absolutely, way more than quadruple. I mean, it's crazy when you think about it. So when you compare Irish nurses at the time to USA, Canada, Australia, this is really interesting, because this is where the whole crux of the matter lies. So you had 55,200 for the midpoint of the payment with regard to US nurses. You had 53,078 for Canadian. Australian had 41,844, and United Kingdom 32,404. Ireland 33,908. So that's roughly 20,000 less per annum per year than Canadian nurses were getting, and much more again than US were getting. Also, of course, Australian, there was like 8,000 of a difference. Now, if you look at the weather in Ireland, the lifestyle, and you go over to, say, Australia, it's wonderful, it's hot, it's beautiful, it's outdoorsy. The nurses, a lot of them emigrated. They went because they went from Ireland and they say, hey, look, I'm super educated, I can work internationally, I'll earn my money overseas in Australia, Canada, USA, and so on, even in England, and I'll be able to come back and have some sort of a life, build some sort of a life for myself here. So imagine an international degree, an English-speaking country, a mature country, a world leader for its size, central to Britain and America with regard to so many multinationals in Ireland from America. Huge links with the forthcoming presidents, Joe Biden, who came from Irish descent, and yet there was this likelihood that these people, which they did, the nurses, had to go overseas. Then suddenly they weren't wanted for years, but that changed. Why? Because Ireland suddenly needed them. You really couldn't make it up. The Health Minister for Ireland, Simon Harris, on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, the guy who just raised the world's awareness of snakes in Ireland. The snakes that were going on decided, well, we need these nurses back. We don't want them, but we need them back. Why? Because we need to save our country, our people. So suddenly the nurses are the most important people amongst all these medics. So doctors, nurses, please come back, they said. And guess what? They did. Because nurses aren't dumb, but more so, they're loving, and they came back for their own people. So they were begged to come back. Your country needs you. The rallying cry was given, and it was received. Then it got very bad for Irish nurses. They had returned. They had the intelligence to return. They had the heart to return. But yet the virus got to them. 1 in 10 nurses got the COVID-19 virus. And the middle of 2020 on average. This happened because they made the decision to come home. They thought, hey, I'll come home, and they might reverse, the government might reserve the payment, and they might decide that, hey, after all, we now get it, we understand that you guys are important. Well, yes, you should have got it in the first place, because you were probably some way delivered into this world by a nurse, a caring midwife, and somebody that helped you out perhaps through childhood if you're sick, and definitely will be at your side, or you hope to be at your side when you're growing old. So eventually they copped it, they brought them back, and the nurses got ill. But the great thing is, there's always a reward for somebody at war, isn't there? World War One, after all, came and went. World War Two came and went. But soldiers got medals. Soldiers that were on the front line that survived and thankfully did not die, they got medals. And it was the front line is what this new name was given to, the nurses, those that were helping others in COVID-19. But you would think that maybe they would get better wages, better actual treatment. No, they didn't. There was nothing given to them in 2020. And yet, 1 in 10 got the virus. They came home and gave up their livelihoods overseas. The livelihoods, the very livelihoods that was forced to be created by the governments that actually pushed them out of the country for them just wanting to be caring, intelligent, professional nurses. Yet they came back and helped others. And they didn't even get a memento, a certificate, a thank you, officially, or a state recognition. The mind beggars belief, but you know what? She's right. Because what has love got to do with it? Well, certainly not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Nurses have the love. So Tina Turner, you sang it well. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time though, thank you for watching and have a great day.